On April 30th, 1789, crowds gathered in the streets of the contemporary capital of the United States, New York City. Members of the American Congress joined veterans of the United States of America, curious and exuberant citizens, and joyous children to watch the momentous event before them. Chancellor Robert Livingston, signer of the Declaration of Independence, strode on stage to give an introductory to the ceremony. Following Livingston came Chief Justice and the first American President, George Washington. The oath of office was administered, and President Washington took the stage in front of his new people. In his inaugural address, Washington laid out the purpose of his administration and the hopes he had moving forward. Unity and cooperation were his main themes. This new nation, while successful in its pursuit of independence from Great Britain, now faced an equal challenge. How should this new republic run? How can the ideals of the Revolution be preserved in this new government when the government before, the Articles of Confederation, had failed? What can this newly independent conglomeration of former colonies organize to become the shining beacon on a hill that Washington believed it to be? What is the role of a president, and how should he run the office? As Washington left the Federal Building in New York, he had ideas on how to establish this new office and form a legacy that would span over 2 centuries. Narrowing down George Washington's compliments and the most notable events in his administration is a difficult challenge due to the sheer importance of his administration. However, it is impossible to ignore the impact he had on the office of the presidency. During Washington's time in office, he laid forth the protocols and precedents that nearly every American president would follow. On the day he took office, Washington gave his inaugural address, laying out the goals of his administration. He declared that his title would be Mr. President rather than Your Highness or Your Majesty, further distancing himself from the autocrats of the Old World. Balls and galas were held to keep the president available to the public, and these events allowed the president to show his dignity and grace that he had worked so hard to carry. In addition, he established how to use the veto power, executive orders, and how to navigate the tumultuous waters of American partisan politics, which would become increasingly hostile during his administration. Throughout his presidency, President Washington dedicated himself to unifying the new but fractured nation. Nearly every act taken was meant to bring the country together rather than splitting it further apart along geographic lines. When assembling the first presidential cabinet, a development instituted by his presidency, Washington gathered his 4 members equally from the North and South. These would inevitably also split the cabinet between the 2 political parties of the time. Later in his term, he laid the foundation for the nation's capital in between the North and South. As the Napoleonic Wars raged in Europe, Washington declared the nation's neutrality to preserve its independence from European powers, as well as preserving a split among the nation's political parties, who fought to persuade him into choosing one side or the other. Learning how to wield the new office did come with its hiccups. Throughout his 2 terms as leader of the United States, Washington's idealism and hopeful nature brought him into impossibly difficult situations. Despite bringing in the greatest political minds of his day in Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph, Washington struggled to manage the beliefs of his cabinet appointees. The infamous cabinet debates between Jefferson and Hamilton required most of Washington's energy. Rather than a unified policy and thought in the cabinet, the differences in political ideology led to extreme measures of conflict. These debates would spill out from the confines of the cabinet and into the open, as Jefferson and Hamilton gathered their allies and attacked one another in the press. Eventually, Washington's policies favored Hamilton's, and Jefferson would resign from his post as Secretary of State. Later on in life, Washington noted that the attacks from Jefferson wounded him deeply, and Martha Washington never forgave the author of the Declaration of Independence. This reliance on Alexander Hamilton would lead to one of the most pivotal moments in the administration of George Washington. In 1791, Hamilton pushed for a new tax on whiskey to bring in revenue that the government could use to pay off its debt. Eventually convinced, Washington implemented the tax, which resulted in an armed uprising in the state of Pennsylvania, putting the federal government at risk from a rebellion and threatening to fracture the fragile United States. At Hamilton's insistence, Washington gathered the army and led it himself to the state. On his way to the rebellion, he issued pardons for those in the rebellion should they lay down their arms. While some skirmishes occurred, Washington's character and leadership would put down the rebellion and establish the supremacy as well as the legitimacy of the federal government. 2 terms proved enough for George Washington, and thus he participated in the greatest legacy of American politics. The reluctant leader and father of the country refused to seek re-election in the hope of establishing a continuation of the presidency. Rather than becoming a dictator, Washington chose to retire to his home in Virginia along with his wife and stepchildren. There he would live out his days until he passed in 1799. Thank you very much for joining us during our first episode on the presidents. Stay tuned as the second video on John Adams comes out soon.